Good morning. Welcome to the ILSoy Advisor webinar, Recent Experiences, What It Reminds Us About Raising Soybeans. Brought to you by Illinois Soybean Checkoff. I'm Todd Steinacher, and I will be moderating the webinar today. Just a couple housekeeping items to start with. If you included your CCA number when you registered for this webinar and you stay with us for the entire presentation, your number will automatically be submitted for one CEU in crop management. If you are listening to a recording of this webinar, you will need to go to Certified Crop Advisor website, log into your account, and apply for a self-study credit. You can ask questions during the webinar by using the chat feature in the dashboard on the right side of your screen. There will be time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. Please keep questions brief and only to one point. Without further delay, I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Matt Montgomery. Matt is a field agronomist with Pioneer and serves growers in West Central Illinois. His previous experiences include serving as a sales agronomist in both Illinois and Missouri. Before becoming an industry agronomist, Matt worked within the University of Illinois Extension System for nearly 20 years. Thanks for joining us today, Matt, and I'll hand it over to you.
Hey, thank you very much. I appreciate the chance to visit with everybody today. We're going to get right into it. I'm actually going to start the timer just to make sure that I keep it in the boundaries of what we've been talking about. The topic today is recent experience, what it reminds us about raising beans, and so I'm going to put the qualifier out there that today's talk really isn't about silver bullets or golden tickets or magic sauce that will be that one thing that will suddenly turn soybean around for you as far as production goes. Today is really a conversation about some of those foundational things, and the last few years just drive home some of those foundational production ideas when it comes to beans. And so we're going to walk through today various portions of the season, and we're going to talk about some experiences I've had over the last few years or things I've noticed over the last few years, and what that reminds me about this art of raising beans in the Midwest. Before we get started, though, I think it's really important that we get this critical concept down. 75% of pods or flowers abort off of that soybean plant. Now, that's a double-edged sword. It's a good thing, and it's a tough thing to deal with. It's a good thing in the fact that the soybean plant produces many more flowers than it ever needs or it ever will be able to support. And it also spreads that flower production period over a long period of time, which means that the plant spreads its risk a little bit. It's not quite like corn. Corn has this really sensitive period that's packed into a period of time, about a week and a half, when it is incredibly vulnerable to environmental stress. Beans are vulnerable to environmental stress, but they spread out that period of time, and because of that, they aren't quite showing that same degree of vulnerability. Now, the maybe tougher thing about that is we're in this constant battle to increase pod count, because if we have this natural 75% pod attrition that occurs out in the field, our best solution, one solution, is to try and nudge back that 75% abortion, and we'll try to do that in various ways. But the other big thing that we try to do is grow the pile of pods to begin with, because then when it's reduced down by 75%, maybe the net of us having grown that pile is we get a positive yield response. And so we're in this constant battle to grow pod count, to grow seed count per unit of area, to try and offset this natural attrition that happens when we talk about soybeans. So I said I'm going to break apart the season into various pieces. We're going to have a preseason talk. We're going to talk about planting time, early season, mid to late season. We're going to talk just a little bit about fertility, and we're going to talk about reproduction. And I'm going to start the preseason out with my kind of constant reminder, some people might call it an all too frequent refrain on my part, this conversation about weed management and herbicide resistance. You'll notice when we talk about soybean production and some of the things that jump out at me, I'm not starting out talking to you about variety selection, seeding rates, row widths, nutrients that you may or may not apply. I'm talking about weed management, and that's for a very important reason. In my 25 some odd year career now, since I stepped out of the university and got to work in the fields and had the honor of working with growers. I've seen all sorts of different pests. I've seen insects that have taken a big chunk out of yield, diseases that have taken a big chunk out of yield, seen nematode populations that were fairly impressive, but only weeds, in my experience, and I think in the experience of everybody here, has the level of devastating impact that if we allow it to, it literally can zero out yield. So you guys are all too familiar with things like this. It's not too hard for us to find fields that look like this. Examples on the left of mare's tail that's very difficult to manage now. Examples on the right of a deficient pre-emerge program when we talk about beans. And you have here just this jungle of amaranth, of water hemp that's covered that field and made it very difficult for us to spot beans at all out there. We don't have to go very far to see that. And in particular, that picture on the right just drives home that fact that when we have this competition, this leaf competition from weed species, and if our goal is to grow the pile of pods so that natural 75% attrition maybe hits us less severe, when we have weed situations like this, you can see very easily how it reduces photosynthetic area, results in smaller plants. Our pile of pods goes down, and we feel that 75% hit even more in beans. This is absolutely critical. If we don't get weed management right to begin with, then every other conversation you and I are going to have from here on out is for naught. Weeds have the ability to take all the input decisions that we do for the rest of the season and basically zero out the impact of those. And so we have to get this right. And part of that is also us thinking about, as we do that, what are we doing to be good stewards of those materials? Now, you guys are way too familiar with this as well, and so I'm not really telling you anything you don't know. Each year, Pioneer produces something called the Agronomy Research Summary, and one of the articles in it this year was this little color-coded map that shows the United States and color codes each state in it so you can get a feel for what their relative resistant weed pressure looks like. But let me just spell it out for you in words here real quick. If you look across the world, we have over 200 cases of documented herbicide-resistant weeds, and 1/3 of those cases happen within the continental United States. Now, you combine that with the fact that we probably won't have any new novel modes of action until the 2030s, and you stop and consider that really it's since about the 1980s that we had new herbicide modes of action introduced into the industry. Pile on top of that multiple resistance. You guys are very familiar with certain weed populations that have multiple mode of action resistance in the countryside. And then everybody's heard this story, but this is a very big development and troubling development, the advent of what we call metabolic resistance, basically plants producing their own safeners so they can metabolize, chew up that product before it can be effective, before it can do what it's supposed to knock out that plant. And of course, the troubling thing about metabolic resistance is that if we allow that to show up in the countryside, that mechanism of chewing up things rapidly can be very effective on herbicides that we haven't even introduced yet. And so it's really important that as we go out and we try to get fields weed-free, clean to begin with, that we also do it in a way that makes us very good stewards of the future. You know, in a lot of ways, the problems that we look at when we talk about weed management really look a lot like what the medical profession has run into when we talk about weed management. And so oftentimes I'll bring up this idea that, you know, really herbicide efficacy is a limited resource, or what we call a common pool resource. You know, there's two different ways that you can lose herbicide tools or pesticide tools. One way is through regulation, and I'm not going to really delve into that today. We've had plenty of other discussions about over the last 25 years where certain products have been regulated away because they lost public goodwill. That's a deadly way to lose a pesticide. But another deadly way to lose a pesticide, and this is, I think, one of the big issues facing us and as an industry, right behind commodity prices, cost of production, is this issue of resistance. The idea that we can lose the pool, that every time we apply something, we can lose the pool, reduce the pool of susceptible individuals that are out there, and wind up with a situation where that product no longer works anymore. I mentioned that this has a lot of similarities to the medical profession, and I oftentimes bring up a slide like this as well. I think the medical profession, it's not perfect when we talk about weed management, when we talk about resistance avoidance, but they do have two great examples of how they figured this thing out, and that's the battle against tuberculosis and the battle against HIV. And basically what they figured out was, instead of burning through products, applying them one at a time and burning that product out and then rolling over to a new product, somebody came up with a bright idea. Let's apply cocktails. We'll just take two products, throw it at the pest at this target at the same time. That will give it two hoops to go over to get resistance, to have resistance develop, and we'll probably be able to salvage both. And that's worked very well. That's why people with HIV still live to this day, because we figured out in the 90s that you threw more than one antiviral drug in a cocktail and tossed that out to people. That idea of a cocktail is absolutely essential. In the last few years, walking out in fields in places like Missouri and getting a look at how you basically in some locations could not see soybeans in the field because weeds were so prevalent has really driven that point home. And just to make sure you aren't thinking I'm just blowing smoke and making loose connections here, remember that Dr. Hager and other people at the University of Illinois did a really interesting survey several years ago now, where they talked to growers in the east central part of the state. They asked them what kind of practices they were engaged in, and then they found out what their resistant weed spectrum looked like. And the thing that jumped out above all others that really seemed to help avoid resistance was the idea of more than one mode of action in season. Basically, that's the cocktail approach. And that's one of the points I want to drive home to you today. If we want to make sure we're successful in soybean production, my last few years of experience and watching people battle this juggernaut of resistance and thinking about how limited our toolbox is, it really drives home this point. Yep, weed free, and it's got to be a strategy that's really good at avoiding resistance from day one. A couple other things maybe to drive home. I don't want to belabor the point too much on weeds here, but I do think it's important, in particular on the weed management front, that we begin to look at our herbicide tools much more like the picture on the right of your screen than on the left of your screen. We've had a habit in our industry of thinking of herbicides as something we apply this year, and then we expect to get all the return for those off of this year. And that's sometimes confined our vision just a little bit. So sometimes we've neglected to spend extra dollars because we've thought about that as a return that we need to have this year. Herbicide purchases are much more akin to a fertilizer purchase. They're much more akin to an equipment purchase. There's a significant amount of goodie that you get out of that purchase this year, but it's a long-term investment. In the case of herbicides, a long-term investment in decreasing the weed seed bank. And because of that perspective, we should be a little bit more willing to do maybe that extra mile, maybe stretch just a little bit, because we're investing in something that's going to benefit us over the long term by maintaining the long-term viability of that farm. So each time today that we close up a section, I'm going to have a little narrative that I'm going to go through, and I'm going to give you the little narrative right now when we talk about weed management. Again, if I can do anything as we get out of this conversation today, one thing would be that this foundational thing, this job one we have to do at getting a field weed free, absolutely has to include a long-term perspective. We want to make sure that we're doing things that throw cocktails out in the field, where we're thinking about decreasing the weed seed bank, where we're willing to go that little extra mile, because we don't want fields that look like what you see on the right with a toolbox that is whittling away. We want to be very good stewards of this limited toolbox that we have for the foreseeable future. And we want to make sure we don't wind up with situations like this with no good options left for us. I'm going to move on. We've talked on that point enough, and I want to move on now to planting. Again, this is a foundational idea, this idea of earlier planting. You've heard this conversation many times before. You're familiar probably roughly with some of the numbers, the benefit we talk about for earlier planting. And I want to go over that, and then I want to provide a few qualifiers. So, oh my gosh, this is a soybean presentation, and here Matt Montgomery is showing a slide on corn, but it's a nice backdrop to make you fully appreciate the impact that planting date has on beans. Now, we aren't going to go through a regression lesson today, but basically, we all know that planting date matters in corn production. But when you graph out just planting date and yield, it's really hard to tease out a relationship. You wind up with a flat line on the screen. And anytime you see a flat line like this, just a rule of thumb is flat lines are bad for describing relationships. If you have a flat line running right across the page, it's got no slope to it, it's showing very little relationship. And in corn, we know that planting date is important to yield, but it combines with so many other interacting factors that it kind of muffles up or hides the impact of planting date. We have a difficult time teasing out a one-to-one relationship on planting date, even though it matters to corn. But if we do that on beans, year after year after year, we see this, right? We see this line that has a definite slope to it. You've heard some of these numbers before. I could have shown you multiple graphs like this and originally intended to do so, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to spell it out. You know, anything from a 1/4 bushel per day to a 1/3 bushel per day, or in 2018, 2/3 bushel per day that we lose for dropping a crop in later, dropping beans in later. And 2018 is kind of interesting when you think about it, because we packed a lot of beans in a relatively short period of time. It wasn't as spread out for planting date as maybe some other periods of time that we've looked at, and still we saw the influence of planting date and how that resulted in maybe this 1/4 to 2/3 bushel loss per day. You know, this is a very recognized weather is not in our control, and this is a good example of a year that did not provide us the opportunity to go early. But in many years, we do have the opportunity to push things earlier, and this is a very low to no cost way to bump up yield in the field. With very little input cost actually to do something like this. And why does it do that? I'm going to take this opportunity just to jump into that conversation here in just a second. But again, it's pretty common to experience a 1/3 to 2/3 bushel loss per day. You know, maybe on average, we're looking at something like 0.4. The thing I've stressed with our growers an awful lot is I don't know that you have to be the earliest. Don't hear things like this if you haven't gone this route and think, oh, this guy's telling me I need to really push the needle really, really early. No, what I'm saying is nudge it earlier, because there's going to be some kind of benefit 9 out of 10 years. So let's talk about why it does that. There are 2 different reasons that this earlier planting thing works. One of them's a big reason, and one of them's kind of a secondary reason. So let's start out with a secondary reason right off the bat. One thing that earlier planting does for us is it increases something called leaf area duration. How long do we have leaf material covering the ground for an extended period of time? And it's not a perfect relationship, and there are little qualifiers to this relationship, but we do know in general in crop production, the higher your LAD, the more leaf material you have per period of time covering the ground, that is strongly correlated to increased yields, because we're increasing the photosynthetic hardware, right, needed to support seeds that will be produced. And if I'm in a battle to inflate the pod count so I don't feel that 75% attrition nearly as bad, you can see why I might engage in this. This is also incidentally the reason why we talk about later planted beans, that maybe we narrow up the rows or bump up the population 10 to 15%, or that if we get in later planted beans significantly later, that we talk about bushier beans maybe. All these strategies are things to increase LAD, to increase the photosynthetic material needed to support seed. But the big thing that really comes into play here is by going earlier, we increase the likelihood that we will have a higher node count. And in each one of those nodes where the petiole attaches to the stem, of course, we have axils that have flowers that can become pods. And if we can increase the number of nodes, we inflate that pile, and that natural 75% attrition doesn't feel quite so severe, and we actually have a net yield gain oftentimes from that. Now, early matters, but it's not a perfect relationship. It's a very strong relationship most of the time between earlier planting and soybean yield, but sometimes that falls apart. And this year was an example of that. So this is a graph I put together a few years ago for the district that I serve here in the west and central part of the state of Illinois. And I basically went through and I looked at precipitation by day over a 20-year period. And I said, each day, how much does that day vary from year to year? So if you look over that entire 20-year period, does rainfall on that day swing a lot or does it swing a little? And of course, there's a lot of natural variation day to day, but there are some periods of the calendar that are much more variable than other periods of the calendar. All periods of time throughout the growing season vary from year to year as far as how much precipitation we get. But the early growing season, when we're trying to get a crop established, and the latter growing season, when we're going through the reproductive period, are the most variable periods of time, at least in my area, for rainfall. And that happens to be the time we absolutely have to get a crop in the ground. Now, this year was a good example of that incredible variability that we see earlier on. We saw a year unlike any other. If you talk to the old timers, they haven't seen anything like this. People who have been farming for generations haven't seen anything quite like what we ran into this year. And because of that, we had some very oddball things happen, right? We had a lot of rainfall that kept us out of the field until late. And then because of that, we had these little cases of things like bean leaf beetles that I usually tend to discount, but were much more impressive this year because we had very few fields planted. So bean leaf beetles piled upon those few fields that were out there and really fed upon them and caused maybe a little bit more leaf injury than what I'm used to. I was not sure really spray-worthy leaf injury. And we had these oddball things like things on the right where we had things like thistle caterpillars that we usually completely discount, but because they came out at their normal time on very small plants because of that delayed planting, because of this oddball season, we wound up with thistle caterpillar able to kind of chew on these leaves a little bit more. In a few cases, people actually sprayed for it. This pest spectrum gives us one more way to appreciate the very different year that we ran into this year. And when you graph out soybean yields versus planting date, you will notice that that line flattened out a lot this year. It's much more similar to the corn line that we're used to seeing than it is the soybean line that we're used to seeing most years. So this year, maybe only a tenth of bushel, a very thin relationship between planting date and yield, which means that a lot of other things after planting date went right for us that offset that delayed planting. So we actually had a lot of other things occur that kind of masked this delayed planting event that we ran into. So for me, when I think about the take-home message on a year like this one, I try to drive home to my growers right now that, yes, I think you still need to count on maybe 9 years out of 10 if we need to put a number on it, or maybe it's 8 years out of 10, whatever. But the vast majority of time, we will see this earlier planting benefit, and you need to still be talking about dropping a crop in earlier. But this year, the fact that we could minimize that impact of a planting delay really shouts out that all these other factors still come into play. And the idea of soybean production is actually a season-long battle. Remember, we're trying to inflate the pod count, and that's a battle that doesn't just happen at one period of time during the season. That's a season-long battle that we're engaged in. So I want to move from there and talk about protecting stand, right? So if we want to inflate the pod pile, we have to make sure that we maintain as many plants out there as possible. We begin to whittle away at stand, and we run the potential to whittle away at yield. Now, we could talk about different pathogens that feed in the soil, but for me, over the last few years, the thing that has really come home to roost to help me better appreciate and demonstrate to people how much seed treatments matter is this little guy right here, this thing called grape COLASPIS. And again, if you're very familiar with the spectrum of pests that we deal with, many of you will hear that and say, now wait a minute, he's going corn again. And I'm going to talk about this thing in corn just a little bit, but hold on, because I don't think we've fully appreciated how severe this pest is in beans. Now, just to give you a feel for how we've kind of had tunnel vision with this pest in the past, I helped actually put together a little fact sheet at Pioneer related to grape COLASPIS. I got to deal with this thing during the early part of my extension career. We struggled to battle it. These small little white grub-like insects that feed on the root system of a plant and can cause them to go to runt-like status for the remainder of the growing season. We struggled 20 years ago to come up with solutions for them. And then neonicotinoid insecticides came along and basically wiped this thing off the table. And then recently, we've seen it reemerge, though, despite the use of those materials, that we've seen some resurgence, and really confused as to why we might be seeing that. And so because of that, I went out this year and tried to help figure out where we might do trials, and kind of stumbled into maybe a way to monitor for this thing. And so we dig these foot-wide holes, and we sculpt off 3-inch layers at a time and roll those out on black plastic, usually about March, and slowly sift through there. And you can find the little white larvae, the little comma-shaped little white larvae. They just jump out on that black plastic. And it gives us at least a way to detect whether they're present. The only way we've had before is to watch a crop be injured. Now, all that patience that you've demonstrated up to this point, waiting for me to say something about beans, is going to pay off, because this thing is really tough on corn. But I want you to look at this next slide and gain an appreciation for how devastating it can be on beans. When we dealt with this pest 20 years ago, we would talk a lot about corn, and I would kind of shake my head because all these publications out east talked about it being a soybean pest. This is an untreated field on the left in Adams County, Illinois. So naked seed in Adams County. And you can see the result of the worst case of grape COLASPIS feeding that I've ever encountered. And it happened in beans, feeding up and down the root system, forming channels on the root system. And the very interesting thing about this, though, was in the middle of this field had to be replanted. But in the middle of this field, we had dropped a soybean variety trial with the commercial lines that we sell. And that seed is all treated. And you'll see me there on the right-hand side of the screen, crouched down there. And you can tell I'm in the soybean variety trial. And right next to it is that untreated batch of seed. And you'll notice the very visual differences. So despite the fact that we've seen this bounce back, I could go to a field like this and other fields and still appreciate the impact and the importance of that treated seed in helping me maintain stand. Now, bear in mind, insects aren't really the major pest we deal with. That's not the major thing we're usually thinking about in beans, is it? We're usually thinking about Pythium, Phytophthora, Fusarium, Rhizoctonia, all those kind of things that we're usually thinking about. And so if you go out and you graph temperature variability throughout the growing season, you will see that early period of time is one of the most variable periods of time that we run into. And so it has all this temperature variability combined with that moisture variability. And because of that, we stoke this incredible environment for plant pathogens, soil-borne plant pathogens, to take over that crop and cause a lot of problems. And so it's really important that we invest in those treatments. And I'll give you a few take-home messages here real quick. Incidentally, one of the reasons that we can talk about earlier planting, or we can talk about trimming back seeding rates, is because over the last dozen or so years, we have dramatically increased the toolbox of materials that are available to us to put on seed. And that's let us drop seed in the ground feeling like, and rightfully so, that we've minimized risk by doing that. It's let us pull back seeding rates from some of the really outrageously high seeding rates we used to have to do in the past. But I will remind you, just a little side note as we're talking about this, that as we discuss the idea of pulling back seeding rates, remember that you can pull them back too far. There is a Goldilocks area in the middle there that we're shooting for. We don't want to shoot too high. We don't want to shoot too low. We want to shoot just right, even though we know that we can get by with very thin stands and still get a crop. The relative risk of doing so is much more accented if we pull the crop back below that optimum seeding rate than is the risk for going just a little bit above that. And that actually was demonstrated by a colleague of ours, Dr. Adam Gasper, who actually quantified the risk associated with different seeding rates, going high, going at the optimum, going low. He was able to demonstrate a lot more risk that you potentially incur by trying to pull it back too much. So within reason, we can pull it back. I just wanted to make sure we dropped in here that we don't want to drop it back too far. So as we exit this part of the discussion today, if I can do a few things, I want to do this. I want to have you remember that picture of grape COLASPIS devastating an untreated bean field. And I want you to take that home with you, and I hope that it helps you better appreciate the value of seed treatment. We don't usually get a good demonstration of the value of seed treatment. We do in this case, and it helps us remind ourselves why we're investing like that. Also, if you're in the west central part of the state of Illinois and you're dealing with grape COLASPIS, keep in mind that surveying technique I talked about. We could use that in beans. All we tell right now is whether they're there or not. We have no thresholds to go with that, but it is a way to at least give you an idea how widely distributed is that pest, and do I have some fields that look like they're fighting it maybe a little worse than other fields, that the relative pressure is a little bit higher than other fields. And so, of course, we use treated seed anyway, but sometimes in those fields, if there are really high populations out there, we might consider pushing the planting of that field back later in the window to get that plant up moving, hopefully growing past the ability of that pest to feed upon the root system. And above all, we can't stand here and wouldn't stand here and say, oh, this is an example of resistance, but it is troubling that that pest has reappeared. We need to keep it in mind. And so it's a very good thing when you look around the industry right now and you see the industry moving towards cocktails, even on seed treatments, because it's absolutely imperative that we do that. Every seed that we're going to plant, if we do it this way, which I think is the appropriate risk managing way, must be treated. And if every seed's going to be treated, then we better have a cocktail out there and not just one mode of action that is allowing us to stoke the development of less susceptible individuals. Let's talk mid to late season here just a little bit. There's a very dynamic pest environment that we run into, and I'm going to run through this portion rather quickly. Soybean cyst nematode, widely distributed, as you are well aware, in the state of Illinois. During extension days, me and a fellow named Mike Rogie did some survey work in the western part of the state and found out that maybe on the order of 75% of the fields had soybean cyst nematode. There's no reason to think that's pulled back at all. We do have this case of nematode populations in Nebraska and Missouri, maybe even hints of Illinois developing resistance to the primary source of resistance that we go up against. And that's all troubling. And if anything, it just reminds us that this pest population, the spectrum of pests, is not static. I've been a person who's had a habit in the past of talking about pests as if they, in beans, just were kind of the same. And beans were these hardy plants that very few things could take down. Beans are very hardy, but the spectrum, the pest spectrum that we deal with in beans does change and is changing a lot here recently. Other examples would be SDS lookalikes like red crown rot that the University of Illinois has documented in the state first time that it's been documented. I think that was in Pike County. Folks to our south who are dealing with DECTES stem borer, that if you look back maybe several years ago in the University of Illinois pest management guide, DECTES wasn't even mentioned in that publication. And here we are in the southern part of Illinois trying to figure out how to manage that thing. And then last year was another great example. You know, we had frog eye leaf spot, we had pod and stem blight. Those two diseases appeared in a way that surprised a lot of us, even people like me, because we tend to have called those cosmetic diseases that we don't think are big influencers of yield. And last year they were undoubtedly, and this year probably a little bit too. And last year it happened because we had a southern summer in the state of Illinois, which gave them a prime opportunity to cause the yield losses that people are very familiar with these two diseases down in the southern part of the United States. Now, because of that, that kind of pulls us into that fungicide value conversation. We continue to see responsiveness to fungicide. I don't think you have to do much grower survey work to find out that people do feel like they're seeing value in fungicide. And some of that reason is physiological. We know that maybe something is happening within the plant, but when you look at the pest spectrum I just talked about, you have to also think that this changing pest environment may play a role in the responsiveness that we see to fungicides as well. So if I can send a few things home with you right now on this portion of it, just don't be lulled into complacency. People like myself in the past really did probably say that beans are hardy and very few things can take them down. We don't need to sit there and believe that's always the case. We have some great examples here of how the pest environment is changing. On things like soybean cyst nematode, even though we see resistance development, the last few years have made me appreciate that rotation to corn matters. Rotating between resistant varieties, even if they have the same source of resistance, matters. And then we are in this great place right now where they may not be the most effective tools all the time, but they're at least decent tools, seed treatments, that we can use against cyst as well. And that helps us get us back to that cocktail management strategy that I talked about earlier. The yield responses to fungicide and insecticide continue to appear. We have every reason to believe, because of those responses, that you're going to see those acres increase over time. If we're going to do that, though, the industry needs to do what it's done for the most part, and that is move towards cocktail pest management. And if you're going to be doing things on your farm, I stress that cocktail pest management idea once again. Let's talk about nutrient demand as I try to make sure I keep trucking along here. I'm not going to talk about nitrogen applications. I'm not going to talk about phosphorus and potash, even though phosphorus and potash are incredibly important. I just want to remind you that the nutrient world is changing as well, and I think something to keep your eye on, and this comes home for me again over the last few years, is how sulfur is going to become one of those nutrients that we'll have to apply one of these days. You guys are familiar with the story about a cleaner environment, which means less atmospheric deposition of sulfur. That's resulted in this very interesting dynamic. These are corn numbers again, but again, I'm going to stress to you, I think this is a bean issue as well, and maybe even more so a bean issue than some other things. We have these mixed results, some cases where half of fields seem to respond, half don't, states where they have a response and states where they don't seem to. And I think that has everything to do with the fact that we're in this transition period. I've got a corn graph here, and I'm just putting it in there to help you appreciate the soybean graph that I'm going to show you in just a bit. This is the corn yield trend line across the United States since the 1970s, and it was the late 1970s that those sulfur studies were conducted. That does not mean those sulfur studies are not valuable. It just means that those sulfur studies were conducted quite a ways back, and you can see why we might be flirting with some supply issues when you look at the kind of crop that we produce now. It's really since the 1990s that corn has been back to that yield level that we talked about in the 70s when those sulfur studies were conducted. But look at this bean line right here. I went ahead and I fitted a polynomial to bean yields. I think here, maybe even last year, Dr. Nafziger talked about how a year or two more and you're going to start thinking that we have exponential growth on beans. And you can see why you might say that. The last few years have been extraordinary increases in bean yields. You can see that curved line going up. And again, the important point for us is it's really since the 1990s and maybe that one blip in 2003. But for the most part, the rest of the time, we've not run into soybean yields that are the same level as what Dr. Haft and Dr. Sawyer would have encountered in the late 1970s. And so if you consider the fact that we probably, maybe a rough estimate is 20, 25 pounds of sulfur that we're getting out of air and then also out of decomposing organic material, and you begin looking at an 80 bushel soybean crop, you begin seeing very quickly how we might flirt very soon with supply issues on that crop when it comes to sulfur. And so I would stress to you that I think sulfur is on the edge of a line, even more than some other things. And I think this is a foundational idea that you're going to want to start here in the near term, dropping out some sulfur strips from time to time in soybean fields to see if you get some response there. And then if you don't get that response, You're going to circle back around in a few years and retest again, because one of these days, so long as the trend line continues and the lack of atmospheric deposition continues, one of these days we will live in a world where we have to apply this as an amendment. Now let's wrap things up by talking about the reproductive period in beans. And I want to really stress again this idea of spreading risk. You know, one of the most sensitive periods of time for the soybean plant is that seed fill period, that period when the pod is filling up with seed. And you can see that if you look at things like a hail study. I just color coded the boxes to give you a feel for where that sensitive period was, right there at R5 and right before that period. So we're talking about latter July and through a good chunk of August as a very sensitive period of time, in this case for defoliation, but for stress in general when we're talking about soybean production. Again, I'll go back to some of these graphs that I demonstrated or showed to you earlier. Remember, I said there's a lot of variability for each day as you look across 20 years' time and how much rainfall we got. But there's a lot of variability beginning of the season and during that reproductive period. This is a lot of variability, a lot of risk that faces a soybean crop, and it's risk that absolutely must be managed. And moisture isn't the only thing that matters to yield, but boy, it plays a big, big role. This is a graph that I put together. This is west-southwest district yields in the state of Illinois as reported by USDA versus rainfall minus evaporation over various periods of time. And you can see that's a very tight relationship. We didn't go into a regression discussion today, but I get an R squared of 46. That means almost half the time, 46% of what is going on with those dots on the page is being predicted by this rainfall minus evaporation thing. How well am I maintaining moisture for that crop has a significant impact upon the yields that you and I see at harvest time, because it influences that late R4 through R5 period when that plant is trying to establish yield. And again, we run into maybe a little bit less variability on temperature from day to day, but a lot of moisture variability. So as I look at a very different and hard to predict environment during that reproductive period, it should come of no surprise then that as I look at maturities, as I look at the spread of maturities available to us, and I plot those over time, I have a hard time finding a pattern, right? So you have 2014 where the very early part of the spectrum seemed to benefit. You have some periods of time where everything seemed to benefit at the same amount. If we look at University of Illinois variety testing, it's really hard to come up with a pattern that's predictable. And so I guess part of what I'm trying to drive at is the ability to outguess Mother Nature and say we need to run to one side of a maturity spectrum that tends to be used in my area or the other is kind of a lost cause, because we don't know what's going to happen with rainfall throughout that late July to August period. Go back to that graph that I showed you just a little bit ago. It's one of the most variable periods of time. We can't predict what's going to happen with moisture. And little differences in temperature can move around the reproductive period a lot, meaning that you and I just aren't going to be able to predict which portion of the maturity spectrum is going to rise to the top. And if we need to find some way to manage this risk, and I can't predict which portion of the maturity spectrum we need to run to, our only strategy then is to spread out our maturities. And I guess even though sometimes we've talked a lot about moving one direction or the other when it comes to soybean maturities, I would encourage you today to strongly consider the strategy of spreading out your maturities, because I think that spreads out your sensitivity to that variability that you and I see. And I think some of those graphs from U of I point at why running one way or the other is a strategy that probably won't work for us. So remember, strongly influenced by August, pre-August evapotranspiration, temps, solar radiation, all those things. Our only recourse is to create a moving target when we talk about reproduction out in the field. So there, as we close things up today, there are many different topics that we just in our 40-some minutes don't have the time to get to. Some colleagues of mine rightfully mentioned that, you know, at harvest time, we should also be trying to find a way to include in here what moisture we harvest things at, that we don't want things to dry down and have shatter, because that's another way that negates all the investment that we've made up to this point. And because I don't have the luxury of time to go even more in depth on even more topics and things that have come home to roost for me over the last few years, I think I want to close our conversation today with this idea. Those ideas we weren't able to cover, I think if we think about our strategy being trying to build that great big pile of pods so that we feel that 75% attrition yet less than what we have when we have a small pile. As you think about inputs, you need to ask yourself, am I managing risk or am I flirting with it? Because I think a lot of the headaches that we deal with can be avoided by asking ourselves that question before we step into things. And with that, I'm going to close things up for today. And I sure thank you for your attention today. And thank you for the chance to kind of share some of the things that have leapt out to me over the past few years.
Okay, thank you very much, Matt. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
I'm going to take a drink here while we're talking.
Yeah, no, definitely. We're going to open up some questions. We got a few coming in, and I'll read them to you, and you can address them how you feel.
Okay.
So question number one, since September was very warm, did it have a positive or a negative impact on soybean yields?
You know, I think that September was probably a positive in that we needed to move the crop along a little bit, right? And I'm maybe stretching here a little bit to think about how I encapsulate this, but you know, we had some mild temperatures in August, and I don't think it was the mild temperatures that saved us so much, because those mild temperatures, soybeans just on a pure temperature basis can probably take some heat. I think the thing that really jumps out though is during mild temperatures, we have a lot less moisture consumption, and we pointed out how that has a positive effect on yield. It's that burning through moisture that tends to go along with higher temperatures that's really the issue. So we got through reproduction, I think, really well, supplying plenty of water needs for that plant. I think that September spell that we ran into, I don't think that we bled off a lot of yield. Somebody may be kind of wondering about it. Beans are a little different plant compared to corn. Did that high temperature in September maybe cause us to lose yield? I don't think so. I think it just helped us get to the finish line. And in late September, there were probably some anxious people that I would visit with that said, boy, I hope we get some warm days just so we can polish this thing off.
Thank you, Matt. Question number two, as you move further north to a shorter season areas, is it early planting more important?
Yeah, I guess in theory, right, that would make sense within reason, right? Because we also have to have a suitable environment to drop the crop into. You know, even though we talk about beans being fairly resistant to cold, we still would like to see warmer trends that are coming our way so that we don't increase the chances for losing stand. But anything we can do when it comes to beans to increase that node number would be pretty important, and the earlier planting would, in my mind, have some kind of more positive effect, although I don't know that I can right now point at a study that absolutely confirms that. If there's one out there, it's escaping my mind at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Question number three, is there a relationship between plant height and planting dates?
Wow, a relationship between plant height and planting dates. So that one can cut two different ways, right? If we're increasing the number of nodes, which we talk about doing if we drop a plant in the ground earlier, yes, we can see a taller plant. But then we also can wind up with maybe differences in sunlight, for instance, that cause a plant to go taller as well. So, or we can wind up with differences in sunlight that cause that internode length to be a little less extreme. I think general rule of thumb would be yes, that you think of an earlier planted bean would probably go a little taller than normal. I don't think, though, that we could say that that's always the explanation for taller beans. A lot of that will have to do with, what kind of seeding rate are we looking at? What kind of ground is it going on? There may be some differences in height there, but it's not purely driven by that earlier planting date. And it's that increased node count that really is what's being driven by planting date.
Thank you, Matt. Question number 4. When are we going to start evaluating soybean yields based on final stands and not on what was planted?
When are we going to say that one more time for me so I can follow the direction of the question? Forgive me.
No, not a problem. When are we going to start evaluating soybean yields based on the final stand and not on what was planted?
Based on the final stand and not on what was planted. Yeah, I think I see where the individual's coming from. At the end of the day, that's what matters, right? Is that how many plants we have out there. And we talked about plant count per unit of area, meaning seed production per unit of area. I guess I'm not sure that we have a better mechanism at the moment, right? If I drop a plant in the ground, and if I plant a field and I plant it at a set seeding rate, that's my best way to kind of increase the odds of getting that higher stand count. I'm not sure if I'm answering that one very well, but I guess I get where that question is coming from. At the end of the day, it's what you end up with that matters. That said, on the front end of things, all we have to do is make sure that we're getting that optimum seeding rate in and then watching what happens from there. I'm not sure what mechanism we could look at to change that. I may be missing the thrust of the question.
Okay, no, I think we're good, Matt. Question number 5. You had mentioned that soybeans can take the cold, but what about the frost?
Yeah, so we talk about frost, and probably in most in classes that I would have gone through starting out, we would have talked about the growing point being above ground and that being a point of vulnerability for the soybean plant, and that is true. But I think we would also say that soybeans are much more hardy when it comes to frost than what corn is, and I'm taking it we're asking about planting time. Maybe we're asking about the end of season, but if we're talking about planting time and emerged plants and a late frost and what its impact is, there's at least seems to be a body of work that says that soybean plant can actually weather that much better than what a corn plant can. For instance, it maintains that tissue a lot better. Again, if I'm understanding that the question was early season, what's that impact rather than impact of frost late season?
Thank you, Matt. I have one regarding the grape COLASPIS.
Yeah.
You kind of hit on that conversation from a seed treatment standpoint for soybeans. What should a grower look for that would help control that?
Yeah, honestly, at the moment, it's our neonicotinoid seed treatments. Then there are some other things like the diamides. They're getting rolled in now with neonics, and I like that prescription of rolling 2 different modes of action there that target the pest. But that's really what it comes down to as far as things that we can do to manage that. In corn, we might talk about a little bit of a planting date. In beans, I hinted at that, a planting delay just a little bit. But really the recourse that we come down to is this idea of seed treatment. We just don't have a lot else on the table. 20 years ago, we tried working with all sorts of different insecticides that we might have applied in band or furrow, and we just never could get one of those to rise to the top as the approach that worked on managing grape COLASPIS. It was the advent of neonics that brought that pest under control. That about that time it disappeared, And I think, again, that seed treatment option seems to be our best option at the moment. So I think that seed treatment option and the idea of maybe rolling in some things like these diamides, it'll be really interesting to watch here over the next few years, what that impact of that cocktail has on grape COLASPIS. Do we, again, push it away and cause it to drop off the page? I hope so, because I really don't want to go back to those days that we lived in 20 years ago where we had no good options.
Okay, question number 7, Matt. It's going to be more from the weed management standpoint. Basically, in recent years, we've talked about layering residuals, you know, as a residual on the front side and then maybe the residual in crop. Yep. What's your thoughts about that layering piece?
I think it's absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I guess recognizing that I'm not a weed scientist by trade, I think that whole layering residual story is absolutely imperative. We want to do whatever we can to keep the field weed-free from the get-go all the way through. And we don't want to have a period of time if we can avoid it, or we want to have a shorter period of time if we can when that residual material breaks down. So by having some more residual there when we put on a post, that seems to make a lot of sense to me. And then the other part is it feels even more so like the cocktail, right? You're putting two things on at once. And I think that's a real positive. I hope that answers that question well.
Yes, thank you, Matt. Well, everybody, we got about another 4 minutes. If anybody's got questions, we would be glad to entertain them.
I sure do appreciate all the questions. Forgive me there on one or two where maybe I didn't understand the thrust of the question, and that's not your fault. Whoever would have asked those, that's just my dense mind not necessarily understanding the question being asked.
No, definitely, Matt. And for anybody listening, if you have follow-up questions, you can go to the ILSO Advisory website, and we can direct questions and answers to Matt or myself.
Well, I really appreciate the time today, everybody. Really appreciate the time to talk about this industry that I have a lot of passion for, and this field of agronomy that I have a lot of passion for, and I hope some of that bled off on you today.
Okay, well, thank you, Matt, for your time and wealth of knowledge. With that, we will conclude our webinar on what we can learn from recent challenges. Our next ILSO Advisor web event will be on December 12th, and you can register for this event or view today's recording and other soybean agronomic resources on the checkoff funded website, ILSO Advisor. Thank you for your attendance and have a great day.